Okay, good evening, everyone. The name of our presentation this evening is called Disclosure in Progress, and it is a progression of disclosure of what is commonly referred to as the extraterrestrial presence. Some people call it extraterrestrial intelligent presence, whatever you want to call it. And this progress is going to be based on a recent video that was released by a man named David Wilcock that many of you are familiar with. And we're going to get into some of the things that he has said in his video, which end up correlating amazingly well with what some of the other work that we in Kaph Ministries have been doing over the past few years. What I want to get across in this video, this is very important, is in the past videos that we put on YouTube that we've given out to the public, there's a lot of speculation about what this disclosure is about. And I believe now we have a much clearer idea of what this is all about and where this is going, especially what the purpose of this disclosure is. So both this evening and in 6 days from now, in about a week from now, we're going to talk about what this is all about, and that's the important message that we want to get across this evening. As a repeat of something we've said before, we want to let you know a little bit about Kaph Ministries and about who I am. My name is Dr. Dale Wong. I have a doctorate in fluid mechanics from a place called Imperial College, which when I attended there was the #1 engineering school in Europe. I've been a Old Testament Bible interpreter for quite some time. I teach classes on the subject. I've written recently a book called The Revelation the Way It Is, which is an interpretation of a sort of the book of Revelation. And my primary focus right now is in discussing matters that connect the Old and the New Testament. So fundamentally, I'm a Bible interpreter, but I also have an engineering background. So this allows me to talk a little bit about physics, because we're going to be talking a little bit about physics this evening in a way which, in my opinion, we are living in absolutely historic times. And this is a moment that is going to be remembered. It's going to be talked about for generations to come. And yet often what happens in historical moments is that people do not recognize they're living in historical moments. This is actually quite common. So I want to be able to point out what's going on, because things are moving quite quickly. And when you see this information that's coming out, and as this begins to become more and more disclosed over time, it's important to understand what is happening. We did a presentation on May the 1st about an historic thing that occurred on April 27th of this year. The United States Navy, as a result of a Freedom of Information Act release, indicated that there were these videos of UFOs from the gun cameras of F-18 fighter craft that were in the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, that these were real, and we discussed some of the implications of that. On July the 26th, we did a presentation which is Disclosure Has Begun, and that was as of July 23rd, where in a New York Times article, they indicated that there were off-world vehicles that our government had, the US government had obtained, and as a result of this, they were now beginning to investigate the implications of this. Well, obviously, if it's an off-world vehicle, it's kind of obvious what the implications are. But nevertheless, of course, they have to couch it in this thing that the Senate Intelligence Committee has to look at it and so on. It's that's kind of a standard thing. But the U.S. military intelligence is telling us, yes, we have off-world vehicles, and of course, we all wonder what the implications of this, and we're going to talk about that today and also next week. Today's presentation is called Disclosure in Progress, and you'll see what we mean by that as we get further into our talk. This is a slide from the last talk that we gave, which are these headlines, which are quoting one of the people named Dr. Eric Davies, who made this testimony to the our U.S. government that off-world vehicles not made on this earth have been recovered, and this is something that we should obviously look into. So this was picked up by National Review, Popular Mechanics, Huffington Post, Fox News, and so on. And so you would think that this was a huge thing. And of course, you'd expect that lots of people would be talking about this everywhere. And frankly, that we have not, that's not what we found. And we're going to talk about that as well as we go forward. On September 16th, David Wilcock, who's a person that I have followed and frankly have admired his work for a very long time, did a very long video, and this is the link if you would like to go and watch it. It runs 4.5 hours, so it runs quite a long time, but the information that he provides is absolutely mind-boggling, and that's what we're going to base our talk about this evening. He refers to the same release of this New York Times article, and he references the New York Intelligencer and says something like, yep, we found off-world vehicles not of this earth, we've held on to them, and we've got them, quoting what the Pentagon said. So he's referring to this, obviously, to the same thing we were talking about in the last presentation we did, and he obviously acknowledges this is a huge thing. So his comment in his video is, holy smokes, this is really, really amazing because it's official. It's out there in the news. It's not superstition anymore. It's not up to debate. They have said this, and they've said that they have multiple crashes they retrieved. This is the moment I've waited for, I've waited my entire life for, and there's lots of people can say the same. They've been waiting for some kind of official acknowledgement, and indeed that's what they got. But David's opinion of what occurred, and this is where we start getting into, let's say, the reaction and the implications of all this revelation, is typical of what you would expect of the informed ufology community. I had a lot of comments that I got from people who viewed the videos and said, well, it might mean this and it might mean that. And this is the interesting response that David has. What now, guys? Are you expecting us to be happy with that for a month and a half, 2 months, 3 months? Then he goes on to talk about, well, what about the Orion Cube? This is another technology. When are you going to tell us about the good and bad guys that are playing cat and mouse game in what he describes as a temporal war, which we'll get into a little bit more. And the other aspect is that a lot of people are simply caught up in this COVID-19 situation where we have a virus and a lockdown in all of these developed countries. And as a result of that, people are thinking about that, and they're not thinking about this revelation. It has been remarkable that there has been very little reaction to this momentous release, but as I just said a little earlier, that's fairly typical of what happens when you're living in historic times. This is what you often get. What I want to do is to talk about some of the other aspects of the video, which are amazing when you start to consider them in detail. David Wilcock has had a number of men and women who are insiders in the U.S. military intelligence that have been feeding him information for many years, and one of these is a man named Daniel. Unfortunately, Daniel died in February of this year, and as a result of that, David is able to speak about him. His name is Dr. Bruce Perret, and he's a physicist, and he's been working on some very interesting projects. In the last video, we talked about this law of one .info. I invite you to go back and have a look at that. That is a high order being named Ra. He was channeled in the early 1980s by a group led by Dr. Don Elkins. And this is one of the questions that was asked. Questioner, just as a sideline, a side question here, is the physics of Dewey Larson correct? And then he goes on to say the sound vibrational complex Dewey is a correct system as far as it is able to go. So in other words, this extraterrestrial intelligence is acknowledging that the physics of Dr. Dewey Larson is correct. Now, hands up, who knows Dewey Larson? Isn't everyone's heard of Albert Einstein, but no one's heard of Dewey Larson. And here's something interesting from this insider, Dr. Bruce Perret. He said, David says in his video, the best physics that he found was from a guy named Dr. Dewey Larson. And it was called reciprocal system, where he says that there is a reciprocal relationship between space and time. So a lot of threads are pulled together by this interesting revelation that he makes, and this is the source of a lot of understanding that we're going to get from this as we consider it. This is a picture of Dewey Larson. This is from a paper that he wrote in 1965. It is really sad that this man did not get the recognition that he should have, because his physics was true, and I think I can say categorically that this man's stuff was suppressed. It's very unfortunate. Here's what he says. We have a universe that we would call spatial. Let's say a spatial part of our universe. And we could represent the volume that it has by a cube, which each side of this cube or box is a length dimension S. Now, what Larson is saying is, rather than thinking of the cube as being like, has to be a cube, obviously it could be anything. But we have this sense that space has some sort of depth to it. It's got some sort of width and height and so on. And that's the perception we're given in the world that we live in. What we may not realize is that this spatial universe that we live in has a mirror, which is 3 dimensions of time. Now that is mind-boggling. The mirror of our spatial experience is a temporal experience, and in this mirror is the 3 dimensions of time, and these two things are connected to each other. So in the reciprocal system, space is a 3-dimensional homogeneous, in other words, it's all the same and isotropic. Time progresses uniformly. We have this sense that time is just marching forward unidirectionally. The scalar relationship between space and time is reciprocal, and this relation constitutes motion. So in Larson's physics, the only real thing is motion. So things are spinning and things are moving in some direction. The appearance of things staying in the same spot is only the appearance of things staying in the same spot. Now this is kind of rather obvious. You could have something that may be sitting there, but we realize that we're on an Earth. The Earth is spinning. The Earth is going around the sun, and the whole solar system is spinning around the galaxy, and the galaxy is moving around other galaxies. So fundamentally, we could say that what he's saying is obviously correct. It turns out that Dr. Bruce Perret was a contributor to this reciprocal system of theory that was Dewey Larson's group of scientists who maintained his physics, even though he was never officially recognized, and no one ever really gave him very much credit. What is interesting is that Dr. Perret was working on what's called the Phoenix Project, which later came to be known as the Montauk Project in the early 80s, that was doing some of the most advanced U.S. military physics on the planet. They had recovered craft from extraterrestrial spacecraft, and they were reverse engineering the craft. And Dr. Perret was one of the main guys doing this on the island of Manhattan in New York. And the Montauk Project is famous for those who are familiar with these matters. There's a technology which is called Project Looking Glass, and it has some very interesting characteristics. We're going to talk about that in the next presentation we're going to do. But Bruce Perret, while he was talking to David Wilcock, he not only connected the work of Dewey Larson to this, but also connected the idea that the law of one was involved in understanding what this physics was, and that was some of the earliest work that David Wilcock did. Now, something which is even more mind-boggling is that David and Bruce were living near or with the gal who channeled Ra, whose name is Carla Rueckert, and way back when. So that explains an awful lot of how David got his information and the information he got when he first started. And obviously this Dr. Bruce Perret was responsible for this. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to, oh, hold on here. I'm just going to do this. Okay, this is an excerpt from the Law of One that we're going to talk about. In the Law of One, it frequently talks about space-time and time-space. For the sake of this slide, in the red is going to be space-time, and the blue is going to be time-space. So when you look at everything, that's what we're going to refer to. The questioner asks, could you tell me the difference between space-time and time-space? The response is, I am Ra. Using your words, the difference is between the visible, so space-time is visible, that's our three-dimensional space world with one dimension of time. Time just seems to march forward. And invisible, which is time-space. So we cannot see time-space. Then then he says, or the physical, that's the space-time world, or the metaphysical. Our metaphysical world is the time-space, which is an invisible world. Using mathematical terms, as does the one you call Larson, that's Dewey Larson, the difference is that S over T, which is distance over time, and T over S, which is time over distance. So let's go into this a little bit more. This is a researcher named Ronald Satz, who wrote a book, which I have a copy of, called The Unmysterious Universe, that he wrote in 1971, based on the reciprocal system physics of Dewey-Larson. On the top of this diagram, you'll see some geometric figures that we're going to describe in just a minute, which is 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time. That's the physical, visible world that we live in. Below this, you see 3 dimensions of time and 1 dimension of space. That's the invisible, metaphysical world that we can't see. On the left side of the diagram is the very low scale that goes down to 0 space, in other words, extremely small, and as you go from the left to the right, it goes to infinite space. So it describes subatomic particles on the left, goes up to particles, it goes up to our solar system, then it goes up to our star clusters. And as you start moving towards the right, you get to larger and larger scales. On the bottom of the diagram, at infinite space, you have zero time. And it swings underneath, and it's the mirror image of the spatial world that goes from zero time to infinite time. So zero space and infinite time are connected, and infinite space and zero time are also connected. So our universe is actually made up of two parts. One is the physical, visible space-time world, and the other is the invisible time-space metaphysical world. If we look at the physical world, it is described by velocity according to Larson physics, which is distance over time. You'll note if time is zero, at zero time, it is infinite, which means infinite velocity and infinite space. On the other hand, if I go to the other side, if I look at the zero space part on the three-dimensional time part of our diagram, if I've got zero space, in other words, it's very, very small, if I put zero in there, I get infinite t over s, which would be the equivalent of velocity in the three-dimensional time world. Now, just to make this clear, what this means is the following. If you were able to go into this three-dimensional time world, traveling would be traveling in time, wouldn't it? That's what we're talking about. So what we're going to become aware of is this three-dimensional time part of the universe, and that's the new world that we're about to get introduced to. So this part of the universe, which is three-dimensional time, is what the law of one calls time-space. Now let's look at a comment that's made by David Wilcock. Gravity is what keeps you stuck in 3 dimensions of space. That's the part in the upper part of the diagram that I've blanked out. Apparently only in 1 dimension, that's 1 dimension of time. When you turn the gravity off, now you're in 3-dimensional time and you can move around. You have all these degrees of freedom. So what he's saying is, if you could block or screen off gravity, then what you can do is you can travel in time in this 3-dimensional time landscape. Now let's look at it from the perspective of flow. If I have, let's say, a box or a cube and fluid is flowing, and if it's flowing through this cube, the movement of this flow is a volume of space which is flowing through some particular time. That would be in our physical space. So this would be the volume of the box divided by the time that it takes for the fluid to flow through the box. On the other side, you would have the flow of time. And what that would look like is a volume of time in a unit of space, and this would be called the flow of time. So once again, instead of describing the box as being a certain length dimension, it would be a certain time dimension. So this would be the flow of time. This is an excerpt from a slide that we teach at Kaph Ministries on the Book of Revelation on a subject matter that is done by Nikolai Kozyrev, who's a celebrated Russian physicist, astrophysicist, who's been quoted over 10,000 times by other physicists and is regarded as the most eminent physicist of the 20th century in Russia. Dr. Kozyrev described that time is a mighty flow embracing all the material processes in the universe, and all the processes taking place in these systems are sources feeding that flow. So he imagined that time was actually a river of time or a flow of time, and that was the source of energy that caused the material world to exist. So now let's just go back up and look at this. When time flows through a unit of space, then what we have is what? The flow of time. And what he's talking about is what? The flow of time. He goes on to say that stars, including our sun, are machines getting energy from this time flow. Now, through a series of experiments and other things that he has done for a very long time, he's been able to establish this principle beyond doubt, without question, in a very convincing way. This is a commentary that comes from the book that I wrote this year called The Revelation the Way It Is. And this commentary is on a passage in the Bible, Revelation chapter 4, verse 11. It says, "You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created." The commentary says the following: this weight, worthiness, is equivalent to the Hebrew kaved, which means weight or weightiness. And then it says, see excursus 5, glory. Weight is the downward flow of energy into a planetary body we call gravity. And what is gravity? It's the flow of time, isn't it? Having weight means Jesus has the ability to control what flows into the planet and thereby affect its electromagnetic energy that determines how things are created and what is created. So what exactly does that mean? That's what we're about to explore. This is also a slide from the teachings that we have. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew God Yahweh appears at the top of Mount Sinai in a thick cloud, and the word thick cloud literally means heavy cloud, using the Hebrew word kaved, which means heavy. The same word that this word is derived from a verb, which means to be heavy, kavad, and in turn, it produces another word, which is kavod, which means glory. So in the Hebrew language, glory and heaviness are regarded as being synonymous, and glory and gravity are also synonymous. So you can see how all of these things are connected. So now let's put the whole picture together. Weight is the inward flow of time into the planetary body from what Yahweh calls glory. This weight, this downward flow of energy, is what we call gravity, which is a mighty flow of time. When this time goes into the earth, the atoms that are in the earth convert this flow of time into electromagnetic energy. So let's see what David Wilcock has to say about this. What happens is that gravity is flowing into this part of space, let's say the earth, and inside an area of a sphere, gravity is turning into electromagnetic energy. So David is saying the exact same thing as what we see in the commentary in the Revelation the Way It Is, and the same thing that Nikolai Kozyrev is saying as well. And this is very interesting, electromagnetic energy is turning into gravity. So that's also very important. So the gravitational well that's forming this thing creates electromagnetism. And what is light? Light is electromagnetic energy. So light is also coming from this flow of time, which is what we would call glory. In other words, the commentary in the Revelation the way it is, the physics of Nikolai Kozyrev, the physics of Dewey Larson, and David's commentary are all saying the same sort of thing. Now to see other correlations between what David talks about in his presentation and what is in a book called The Collections, written by author Jürgen Burgess, which is talking about the coming salvation that Yahweh is offering the extraterrestrial beings. Yahweh is the God that's presented in the Bible. And here's what David says in his video. The Earth, the core of the Earth, is actually plasma. It's not an iron ball. Plasma creates electromagnetic fields. In the collections, there's a poem called The Plasma Beings, and it describes them as the first beings that existed in the universe. And here's what it says. Life begins where life will, according to the will of those who choose to live a life on a place where time and space portray the events. So long ago, before there was anything, life was quite different than today. It grew and swarmed in the essence of the creation. The fields of energy that existed then, in these fields the plasma beings lived. And they harvested and were harvested by their parents who came from me when it was decided to let things grow in the time and space we created together. So now we start to get into some very interesting physics, and we're going to pick up this more in detail in the next presentation we're going to do, because we're going to discover that there are 5 groups who are currently producing craft which are base their technology on manipulating the flow of time or gravity as a result of creating the ability for the craft to move. And we're going to talk about that. So what I'm saying is this technology is happening right now. This physics is going to be proven right now. So you don't have to speculate if this is right. We don't need some university professors to run around and say, well, let's get some experiments together. You're going to be able to see these technologies in action, operational, in the very near future. And so the validity of this kind of physical description is without question. So seeing and doing is going to be believing. So here's what David says. When you shield off your gravity, this is the big secret that everyone knows in the inside world. Here we go. When you shield off your gravity, you also shield off the flow of time. So showing once again, gravity and the flow of time are the same. If you do this, that's what happens. And now here's what it says. And now time doesn't move for you in that local area. So what that means is that time essentially is not moving at the same rate or at all relative to the time that's around the area that's been shielded. And that's the technology that allows these craft to operate. There is a poem which has the innocuous title called The Currents in the collections. And here's what it says. Water streams wherever it may go, like the spirit that moves from place to place. Water moves as time flows. Let's repeat that. Water moves as time flows in endless streams from star to star. The sun shines and times change. Seasons come and seasons go, like water moving from place to place. When water stops, it's not flowing anymore. When water stops and stands in place, it heaps up and binds its quarry and awaits instructions from waves of energy that travel with it, that move like currents of water and spirit to and fro in endless tides. Its obviously talking about the same thing. David goes on to say, what we're dealing with is that time and space are essentially two different versions of the same stuff. The Hebrew scriptures and the Hebrew priesthood have known this for thousands of years, that they do not essentially distinguish time and space. They say, just like David is saying, that time and space are basically the same. So here's a poem called Space in the Collections. Space is the place of here and there. Its point is its pointlessness apart from time. In time is space, and space has time. Kind of like the same stuff, right? That cannot be extracted from each other. Otherwise, it's pointless. Space remembers all that it portrays and transmits its information to all those who can receive. Remember, time is invisible and metaphysical. Space is physical and it can be seen. Space was made by me and by you. This is speaking to these extraterrestrial beings. For you are wise in the ways of space and time, but I have created a place called holy, that I made from holy, where you cannot come unless you are holy. So add that to your wisdom. Okay, so let's wrap up this presentation for this evening. On October the 4th, that's Sunday evening at 8 o'clock Central Time, we're going to do the follow-up to this one called The Manufacture of Anti-Gravitic Craft. We're going to take the discussion of physics that we did today, and we're going to then go into David's video. Highly recommend you watch it. I realize it's a long one, it's 4.5 hours, but it's well worth watching. And we're going to see that this is now becoming technology and physics that we are going to see in everyday life in the coming year ahead of us. We're going to see the reason for why they released these patents by Dr. Salvatore Pais that we talked about is because these patents are being used to create these craft which are going to be able to hover, that are going to be able to potentially go to faster than light speed and so on. So the craft are being made right now and be used and available in some forms to the general public. So all of this stuff is about to become real, and it's based on some very interesting understandings of gravity and how time works. One of the things to look out for is that the craft can become a time machine. That's right, the craft can become a time machine with the right sort of constraints put on it, which means time is very real. But as we are surely aware, if that's the case, that there are people who are already doing this, and that's obviously worth knowing something. Okay, that's all I have for this evening, except to let you know that if you would like to attend the Skype session like the folks we have today, email us at kaphministries@protonmail.com in the email address we've got here, and we will add you to the list of people that can attend the Skype session on October the 4th, and we invite you to do so. So we look forward to seeing you on our Skype session if you'd like to join, and thank you for attending this presentation.